Salam sejahtera, anda bersama saya Rizal Zulkafli dan ini Niaga AWANI. Saya masih lagi bersiaran dari rumah. Jadi kita mulakan dengan laporan 9 pagi ini dengan rangkuman dagangan ringgit dan juga Bursa Malaysia pada Selasa. Ini sementara kami menantikan angka pertama dagangan Bursa Malaysia dalam PKP 2.0.
Ringgit ditutup rendah berbanding dolar Amerika pada Selasa apabila pelabur masih tidak pasti berhubung pelaksanaan semula PKP dan pengisytiharan darurat. Pada 6 petang, ringgit susut 70 mata asas untuk ditutup kepada 4.0550, 4.0600 berbanding dolar Amerika. Bagaimanapun, Ketua Ahli Ekonomi Bank Islam Malaysia Berhad Afzanizam Abdul Rashid percaya pengedaran vaksin pada Februari akan beri keyakinan bergerak ke hadapan. Berhubung dagangan Selasa, Afzanizam berkata dagangan ringgit berbanding dolar tidak menentu pada sesi pagi dengan unit tempatan susut apabila pasaran mula mencerna pengumuman darurat. Bagaimanapun, katanya pada sesi tengah hari keadaan kembali stabil. Afzanizam percaya ringgit berbanding dolar Amerika akan kekal didagangkan dalam dagangan jajaran kecil dalam tempoh terdekat ini. Pada penutup, ringgit juga diniagakan rendah berbanding mata wang utama lain pada Selasa. Sementara itu, menurut laporan bernama, Bursa Malaysia kembali tenang apabila jualan panik berkurangan selepas Perdana Menteri Tan Sri Muhyiddin Yassin memberi jaminan bahawa aktiviti perniagaan kekal seperti biasa walaupun diisytiharkan darurat. Pada 5 petang, penunjuk pasaran FBM Klci merosot 5.21 mata. Indeks berada antara 1,590 dan 1,621 mata sepanjang sesi dagangan. Ahli Ekonomi Bank Islam Malaysia Berhad Adam Muhammad Rahim berkata reaksi segera dalam pasaran saham dan jualan panik dalam kalangan pelabur yang dilihat sebelum ini tidak dapat dielakkan berikutan bimbang langkah kerajaan mungkin akan menjejaskan ekonomi yang telah menerima impak akibat COVID-19. Adam turut yakin bahawa impak ekonomi daripada pelaksanaan semula PKP adalah kurang berbanding PKP pertama yang dikuatkuasakan pada Mac tahun lepas. Muhyiddin menjelaskan aktiviti ekonomi negara akan terus berfungsi sepanjang tempoh darurat tertakluk kepada pematuhan SOP dan pelaksanaan semula PKP. Perdana Menteri berkata kerajaan akan pastikan aktiviti ekonomi tidak terhenti agar rakyat dapat terus bekerja manakala perniagaan, perdagangan dan industri mampu beroperasi seperti biasa. Kerajaan juga komited pastikan amalan tadbir urus terbaik terus diamalkan sepanjang tempoh pelaksanaan darurat ini. Muhyiddin berkata demikian dalam perutusan khas darurat. Terdahulu yang di-Pertuan Agong Al-Sultan Abdullah Riayatuddin Al-Mustafa Billah Shah memberi perkenan pengisytiharan proklamasi darurat yang dilaksanakan sehingga 1 Ogos sebagai langkah proaktif bendung COVID-19 di Malaysia.
Dan saya turut dapatkan pandangan pengarah strategi pelaburan Naga Group AG Jamil Ahmad menerusi Skype di London berkenaan sentimen pasaran dan apa kesan PKP dan juga darurat kepada pasaran kewangan di Malaysia. Saksikan rakaman temu bual berkenaan.
Jamil, let's start with the MCO and the emergency announced by the government. How has this affected Ringgit so far? I think we all know that Ringgit shed around 70 basis points to close around 4.0550 to 4.0600 against the dollar. But what's your outlook for Ringgit after this announcement?
So it's a short-term blow for the Malaysian ringgit. It's fallen today, and the Malaysian stock market in particular fell today. But generally speaking, if you look at what's happening in the market, and if you look at the wider currencies in the baskets, you can see that currencies like the Indonesian rupiah fell more against the US dollar during trading today. So we can't say the ringgit losses are just because of the lockdown, but of course there's going to be economic implications of this, and it's a matter of trying to find the balance between health costs and the cost of health due to the infection outbreaks getting worse and worse, and trying to find the compensation for economic damage. I'm somewhere in the UK where we've been in lockdowns now pretty much for the past year, with exceptions of a small period over the summer, and we still don't have the answer over here. So if you guys can be under a strict lockdown and get this correct, you will have a much better 2021, whereas the most of us in developed societies don't have the opportunity, sadly.
And Jamil, many other countries and economies are also taking the same steps to curb this new wave of COVID-19. How do investors react immediately after this announcement? Do you think investors could probably get a bit calmer after the first few days?
Well, actually, I thought that investors would have reacted much worse than what they already have. You've got, it's no longer a second wave, it's a second variant. And that's a really nasty combination, a force. But generally, the markets have been very resilient to that risk. And the only reason why must be because they're expecting governments to do more in terms of economic and monetary stimulus, central banks to also do more, and other authorities, because really, generally speaking, the markets are trending very high, but they're not the valuations are not where they should be, because valuations should be much lower for the real impact of the economy. And perhaps everybody sees the vaccines as the lottery tickets and the getaway to go to a paradise or something, because that's the only more suitable explanation behind why markets are not falling further than what they already have.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned, I think you mentioned fiscal and monetary stimulus, perhaps to follow announcements like this. Do you think the government should announce fiscal and monetary stimulus to maybe support the economy? Because I think right now the announcement is for 2 weeks, but people are expecting this to go on for a bit longer.
I think that the longer the time persists, the more opportunity and the probability will be higher that authorities will step in, whether that's the central bank, monetary authorities, or the government officials, economic ministers, and so on. Generally speaking, 2 weeks is not that bad. Of course, the train of thought from what's happened in other countries is that 2 week circuit breakers generally lead to 1 month, and then if it doesn't get right in the 1 month, it will persist for much longer. I know that better than everybody from sitting in the United Kingdom. But I do think that talking about stimulus and what sort of measures we can expect from Malaysia over the coming weeks and months, it's pretty much a dead on certainty for me that the potential and the probability for lower interest rates in Malaysia is superb. And at least the country has that at its disposal, and it can do that to help the economic momentum, because again, we're seeing somewhere where we're close to negative interest rates. It's not possible, but at least where you guys are, you still have interest rates at least in a positive number.
And how has the local index, the FBM KLCI, performed today, and what are the sectors most affected by these new announcements?
So strangely, the sectors that seem to be most sensitive to this kind of announcements, banking stocks, which is quite peculiar because banking is generally seen as essential services and so on. But generally speaking, you would look at retail, retailers, you would also look at the hospitality and the restaurant sector. Those are the stocks that you would attack. So why banking stocks are always the ones that are on the front line of this kind of damage in the trenches it remains to be seen. But generally speaking, I would go on the hospitality, the airline sector. I know that these sectors have been through a very difficult 2020, but unfortunately 2021 is pretty much the same. There hasn't been any changes in terms of these businesses can still not get back to anywhere near what they remembered just 15 months ago.
Mm-hmm. And Jamil, I'm sure we can all agree that communication is important. What kind of info do investors or information does investors need to sustain confidence in the Malaysian stock market?
Generally, we need clear guidance, forward guidance, particularly with the timeframes. It's great that they've said 2 weeks. If there's a potential for it to be longer than 2 weeks, that needs to become clearer, not just before the 2 week circuit breaker ends, but before then, because this is a very fluid situation. Everybody's human to this situation. They understand it's not something that somebody can really control. It's a circumstance that is out of our control. But what we can control, it's our actions and our efforts combined to prevent the spread. So I think that kind of communication and guidance, that this is a very fluid and moving situation. Nobody knew a second variant would turn up. Nobody knew how long it would be to get a vaccine and so on. These are all variables that authorities can't really control, but what they can control is the messaging and what they're going to try and do to help people through it, because people also need confidence. They need to feel settled, and then the people obviously need to take their own precautions because they are in control of their own personal situation.
And Jamil, could you share with us, because you are in the UK and you monitor the UK, Europe, and also the global market, but tell us about how governments in the UK and Europe are doing this, and what are some of the best practices that maybe governments around the world could take from these new announcements?
So generally, Western societies and Western governments, they've been the ones that it would be very harsh to say they've got it wrong, but you can see that they've been in this battle and this war for the longest. So there's this way to say that, your more authoritarian regimes, whether that's in the Middle East or some areas of Asia, South Asia, and so on, they saw one big period of a lockdown. It was obviously difficult, as it's been everywhere else, but after that one period, things have gradually got back to normal with a few twists and turns here and there. But if you look at the more Western democracies, whether that's the United States, mainland Europe, the United Kingdom, these are countries that are pretty much over the last 1 year they've been in this, they haven't changed. They're still pretty much remaining. Yes, the United States will not enter another lockdown, but if you look at the United States coronavirus, that infection outbreaks, it's very clear that that problem still persists.
And do you think investors could perhaps move to safer assets, including government bonds, in Malaysia, perhaps?
Yeah, it's possible. I think government bonds, obviously, because the government has its own interest to help these asset classes. Of course, that is possible. But I also think there's a lot of alternative assets that investors are watching too. I don't want to talk too much about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency space, but that pretty much is the flavor of the month in terms of the word of the day. Generally speaking, the US dollar has performed much better in 2021 than we would have thought, but I just think that's a short-term recovery. Generally speaking, I think that the assets like the Malaysian ringgit will continue to strengthen in 2021 for as long as the dollar is weaker. And the lockdowns do not really change that perspective unless the Malaysia enters a much longer lockdown, which I hope is not going to be the case for you. So if I look at stocks, oil, the ringgit, emerging market currencies, those are the assets that still have a lot of potential to strengthen even further than what, their value today.
But do you think this new lockdown could perhaps affect Malaysia's ratings moving forward?
No, because it's not idiosyncratic. If this was a lockdown, if Malaysia was on its own battling this second variant, and if it was the only country that was going through this and all of the economies were closed to Malaysia and Malaysia was in a much more isolated place, then yes, that would be the biggest fear. But right now, Malaysia's going through the exact same thing, maybe a more modest or more mild or perhaps a little bit of a more difficult position for some people than other economies and other countries are going through. It's not an idiosyncratic, it's not an isolated thing. And because of this, the ratings agencies can't just move to Malaysia, not move somewhere else. So if the rating agency is going to move, they're going to give everybody a slap on the hand, so to speak.
What about the global markets? What can we expect this week as we get closer to the inauguration?
So I was concerned that when those very unprecedented events took place at the Capitol last week, the markets would really toil off, because those are scenes that you only see in the most chaotic emerging markets, if that even happens there. But generally speaking, the swiftness of the Congress to certify Joe Biden as the winner of the 2020 elections and that he will be inaugurated just over 1 week from now, that seems to have helped markets find some sort of calmness. But we need to see that Joe Biden, when he is inaugurated next week, firstly, that everything moves smoothly from a monetary perspective, but also that he gives his message of unity, trying to bring the world back together, trying to get everybody working together, and so on. This very collaborative nature that we seem to be missing from all the different aspects of the world right now, because everybody's facing their own battle. And if that kind of message persists and he's able to really get that motive and get that trumpet out, then I think global markets can perform much better under Biden than what people are giving him credit for.
What are some of the announcements expected this week that could perhaps influence sentiments, investor sentiments this week?
So interestingly, the economic calendar for this week is not actually as full of tier one releases as you would expect, but we do have the United States retail sales right at the close of the week on Friday afternoon GMT. Now, the United States retail sales is going to be a critical indicator, because we cannot forget that the United States contribution to the global economy is still massive. It's still bigger than China's at this stage. So if the United States economy is not in a good place, it's not good news for any of us in particular. And in particular with the retail sales, that is 70% of the United States economy is consumer. That basically means what me and you spend on the street if we were Americans in the United States. That's our contribution to the economic growth. And with the United States employment reports coming in very negative, it looks like the jobs recovery is no longer progressing in the United States. It's still minus 10 million jobs of February, March 2020, which is astonishing, but sadly it's the truth. And if retail sales continue to suggest that real incomes are falling, consumers are not prepared to spend money, or they can't spend money because they're concerned over their financial circumstances, this does suggest that the authorities will need to provide more help to world economies, because world economies will face a slow battle away from this pandemic. I think everybody sees this vaccine as the ticket, as the light at the tunnel, and that might be the case, and we hope it's going to be the case, but it does not change the economic problems that have been created.
Let's finally talk about the oil price before we end the interview. I think yesterday or still this week, people are still talking about the decision by Saudi Arabia to cut 1 million barrels per day. Tell us about that, and will this perhaps support oil prices as it move forward into perhaps the first quarter of 2021?
It already has supported oil prices. The efforts from OPEC and OPEC Plus, specifically over the final quarter of 2020, helped oil price go up somewhere like 30% over the 3-month period. It's up over 7% in 1 month. We have not had an oil price, if we talk about US WTI crude, above $50 since February of 2020, which was right at the beginning of the pandemic shock. So if we still have oil prices that are able to consolidate around these levels, we can talk about $55 and $60 later in 2021. I would say that oil space is the asset that you need to watch in 2021 because it can perform much better than it's been given credit for. And what the bad news is if we fall back below 45. But generally speaking, I think oil price is one of the more consistent assets, bearing in mind all the volatility we have in other global asset classes.
And you mentioned about $60 per barrel. Will that perhaps support ringgit to become stronger against the US dollar, or are there other factors coming into the strength of ringgit against the US dollar?
So Malaysia is not the most sensitive oil exporter, but it's a big contributor to global government revenue, and because of that, yes, there would be a correlation. Stronger oil prices should suggest a stronger Malaysian ringgit. That's hand in hand. Generally speaking, we've got the Malaysian ringgit now that's ranging somewhere around the 4 mark against the US dollar. Should the US dollar fall based on the vaccine, based on all of these more positive pictures that you have for 2021, I do think the ringgit could go towards 380. Which would be the levels that the ringgit has not really faced since about 2015, 2016 time. So I do think that 2021 can be a lot of a better picture for the Malaysian ringgit and even Southeast Asian currencies as a whole.
On that note, we thank you very much, Jamil, for joining us.
Kita akan berhenti berehat sekali, kembali selepas ini.